The sound of machinery filled the air long before sunrise touched the edges of the airfield. Engines idled in the distance, tools clattered in the hands of tired mechanics, and the sharp scent of fuel drifted across the cold concrete. In the middle of it all, surrounded by noise and pressure and the weight of a war far larger than anyone could understand, stood an unremarkable man with an idea nobody expected to matter. His name was Edward Clarke. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't even supposed to be working on flight-critical components. He was an engineer, a quiet one. A 30-year-old factory-born problem solver with a habit of staring at aircraft for too long, looking at them the way a mathematician looked at equations. Not with awe, with curiosity, with suspicion, as if every rivet might be hiding a mistake. He had been transferred to a forward operating base in 1943 not for his genius but for his patience. Someone in logistics thought patience was enough to fix planes. Clarke quickly learned it was. The bombers stationed at this base were in trouble. Real trouble. For months, B-17s and B-24s returning from missions came back with the same disturbing patterns. Bullet holes were expected. Flak damage was inevitable, but the failures that shook the engineers the most happened during landings. Wings buckled, control surfaces jammed, hydraulic lines burst. Sometimes bombers simply refused to respond to the pilot's commands in the final seconds before touchdown. The result was always the same: another crippled aircraft being dragged off the runway, its crew stepping out shaken, silent, and painfully aware they had survived by inches. The pilots had their theories, weather, fatigue, enemy rounds hitting hidden places, but Clarke saw something different, something subtle, something mechanical. One morning, after a particularly rough landing that nearly tore a bomber in half, he crouched beneath the battered wing and traced a hand along the flap assembly. The metal was warm, misshapen in tiny ways that didn't appear on factory surfaces. The bolts showed uneven stress. The hinges bore tiny fractures that repeated from aircraft to aircraft. The flaps were failing. Not catastrophically, but enough to turn every landing into a gamble. The more Clarke inspected, the more concerned he became. These bombers were flying eight-hour missions over enemy territory. They faced cannons, fighters, and anti-aircraft fire powerful enough to tear them apart, and yet many failures weren't coming from combat. They were coming from wind. He didn't tell anyone, not at first. Clarke had a habit of thinking too long before speaking, and this idea wasn't just risky, it was borderline impossible. But that night, lying awake in the cramped engineer's quarters with tools still in his pockets, he kept revisiting the same mental image. The flaps twisting ever so slightly under stress, distorting airflow, turning predictable landings into unpredictable chaos. He sat up, lit the dim lamp, and sketched. Not a blueprint, not a design, an idea. A way to stabilize flaps under severe stress without replacing the entire assembly. A way to change the way air behaved over the wing. A way to give pilots control when they needed it most. A small change. A nearly invisible modification. A shift so subtle that no one from the design teams back in the States had ever bothered with it. The next morning, he brought the sketch to the lead maintenance chief, an older man with 20 years of aircraft work behind him and no patience for experiments. "What's this?" the chief asked. "A reinforcement concept," Clarke said quietly, "for the flaps." The chief glanced at it once and immediately shook his head. "No alterations to primary control surfaces, you know that." Clarke didn't argue, he simply nodded and folded the paper. But he didn't throw it away, he kept working, observing, measuring, testing movements of damaged flaps during maintenance hours, and every time he confirmed the same thing. Under heavy load, the flap flexed just enough to disrupt lift. That disruption changed landing behavior. A change in landing behavior meant unpredictability. and unpredictability meant deaths. Weeks passed, the failures kept happening, and the pilots kept demanding answers. One afternoon, after another crash landing nearly wiped out a returning crew, Clarke stood inside the hangar alone with the damaged aircraft. The bomber rested at an angle, one wing low, hydraulic fluid dripping softly onto the concrete. He climbed the maintenance ladder, leaned over the flap, and pressed his weight against the hinge assembly. It gave too much. Not by inches, by millimeters. But in aerodynamics, millimeters mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. He looked around. No officers. No mechanics. No witnesses. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the sketch. He wasn't supposed to modify anything. He wasn't authorized. He wasn't cleared. But he had a conviction rooted deeper than regulation. If he didn't fix this, more crews would die. The idea gnawed at him until the decision made itself. He went to work quietly. He didn't replace the flap. He didn't redesign the assembly. He added something simple and entirely against protocol. A small aerodynamic stiffener hidden inside the hinge housing, subtle enough that the flap's external appearance didn't change at all. It was just a strip of reinforced metal, shaped perfectly to guide airflow and resist twist during high loads. Nothing more, nothing that anyone would notice unless they opened the assembly and studied it closely. He finished late, wiped the grease from his hands, and walked away before anyone saw what he had done. The next morning, the bomber took off. Clarke stood at the far side of the field, heart pounding harder than the engines as he watched the plane climb into the sky. All he could do was wait. If his idea failed, he would be responsible for destroying a bomber and killing its crew. If it worked, nobody would ever know unless someone asked the right question. Hours passed, the sky remained quiet. Then faintly he heard the distant growl of engines returning. Clarke held his breath. The bomber appeared over the tree line, descending in a wide arc. Its landing gear dropped cleanly. Its flaps lowered. The approach remained steady, smooth, controlled. The touchdown was perfect, better than perfect. The aircraft rolled down the runway without a single lurch. The pilot stepped out smiling. Clarke didn't smile back. He just felt his knees weaken in quiet relief. But then something unexpected happened. A second bomber landed just as smoothly. Then a third. A fourth. One by one, bombers touched down with a precision the airfield hadn't seen in months. Clarke hadn't touched any of those aircraft. Something else was happening, something bigger. Slowly, he realized the truth. The pilots had learned to adjust their landing technique to compensate for the flawed flaps, but his modification made the behavior predictable again. They landed cleaner now because their instincts were correct again. Clarke watched the landings closely. Each one confirmed his suspicion. The issue wasn't pilot error. It wasn't weather. It wasn't flak damage. It was the flaps. And his solution wasn't just helping one bomber. It was exposing a problem affecting all of them. He knew what he had to do next. He walked into the maintenance bay, took a deep breath, and approached the chief. "I have something to show you," Clarke said. The chief frowned. "This better not be about your sketch." "It is." The chief looked exhausted. "Clarke, I told you." "The flaps are failing under stress," Clarke said calmly. "Not visibly, but structurally. It's small, very small, but enough to disrupt airflow at low speed. The pilots have been compensating without realizing it, but the wear is getting worse." The chief stared at him, expression hardening. "You modified a bomber, didn't you?" Clarke didn't lie. "Yes." The chief closed his eyes. You know what that means if you're wrong." Clarke nodded, "Yes, sir." "Show me," the chief said. Clarke led him to the aircraft. He opened the flap assembly. The chief bent down, studied the reinforced strip, ran a finger along the new contour, and stayed silent for a long time. Then he sighed. "You're not supposed to do this," he said softly. "I know." "But the results," the chief exhaled again. "The landings were cleaner today. Something changed." Clarke remained silent. "Do it again," the chief said, "but this time we won't pretend it never happened." It was the beginning. Not of recognition. Not of praise. Of work. Long nights. Secret fixes. Unofficial adjustments spreading from aircraft to aircraft, hangar to hangar. Within 2 months, the modification reached every bomber on the field. Pilots reported smoother landings, fewer hydraulic failures, fewer sudden wing drops on approach. Then word spread to nearby bases. Then across the entire region. Requests came in. More bombers arrived for reinforcement adjustments. More mechanics copied Clarke's concept. More missions ended with aircraft returning safely. One general asked the question that sealed Clarke's place in history. How many aircraft have landed safely because of this? The answer shocked everyone. More than 1,000 bombers. More than 10,000 aircrew. More lives than Clarke could ever count. All saved by a quiet engineer's crazy wing flap idea, an idea he wasn't authorized to install, wasn't encouraged to create, and wasn't supposed to even think about. But he had, and it had changed everything. He didn't seek credit. He didn't demand recognition. He never even raised his voice about the solution. He simply kept working. Kept fixing, kept improving, kept saving crews one landing at a time. And the war kept turning because of men like him, men whose ideas didn't look heroic, didn't look dramatic, but ended up changing the fate of entire air campaigns. Clarke's modification didn't make headlines. No newspaper ever printed his name. But every bomber that landed safely because of him carried the weight of his decision in its wings. A small idea. A subtle reinforcement. A crazy thought that everyone else ignored until the results became impossible to deny. Clarke never asked for gratitude. He never needed it. He knew the truth. Sometimes the biggest victories don't happen in the sky. They happen in the hangar, under a wing, with a wrench in your hand and a problem nobody else bothers to solve. Clarke didn't expect what came next. Word traveled faster than he ever imagined. At first it was just whispers among mechanics exchanged between hangars during long nights. Then squadron leaders began sending men over to observe landings and quietly ask questions. Before long, officers from neighboring bases, some skeptical, some desperate, arrived with notebooks, clipboards, and questions about airflow and hinge stress that Clarke never thought anyone would ask him. He answered softly, calmly, always with the same steady tone, the same careful clarity, not because he wanted praise, but because he didn't want to give anyone the wrong impression. This wasn't a magic fix, it wasn't a miracle, it was airflow, it was structure, it was physics, and physics did not care about rank, tradition, or doctrine. It simply worked. Soon, aircraft arrived specifically for the modification. Some came limping in on one functioning engine. Some came in with wings riddled with holes. Others arrived shaking from turbulence and battle damage, pilots pale from adrenaline and exhaustion. They landed smoother than they should have, even when everything else on the aircraft seemed ready to fail. The maintenance chief watched these landings with a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. He knew how much danger had been averted. He also knew how much trouble they were in if higher command decided Clarke had violated procedure. For weeks they worked quietly, unofficially, always with the hangar doors half open, always watching for officers who might ask too many questions. Clarke would spend long nights kneeling beneath the wings, tightening bolts, filing edges, making sure every modification matched his precise calculations. He didn't want a single aircraft flying with a misaligned stiffener. Predictability mattered more than anything. A tiny deviation could undo the entire design. The chief eventually joined him, offering a silent hand with wrenches, rivets, or measurements, not because regulations allowed it, but because reality demanded it. One night after finishing the 50th bomber, the chief leaned against the wing and sighed. "You realize," he said quietly, "that half this airfield is landing safely because of your idea." Clarke didn't respond. He just wiped his hands and checked the hinge again. "You should take credit," the chief said. "I didn't do it for credit." "I know, but men have died for less." Clarke didn't lift his head. "That's why I did it." A silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. The chief patted the wing and walked away, leaving Clarke under the dim yellow light hanging from the rafters. But war didn't slow down. It never waited for engineers to finish their work. Missions increased, weather worsened. Japanese fighters grew more aggressive. Every bomber that left the field returned with fresh damage, fresh stories, fresh evidence that the skies were becoming deadlier. And Clarke's modification became more essential. By early spring, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Bases across the region started reporting a sudden drop in landing accidents. Pilots described their approaches as stable and predictable, even after hours of combat. Commanders noticed the survivability rate ticking upward. Out of nowhere, maintenance logs showed a sharp decline in flap failures and hydraulic blowouts. Somebody finally asked why, and the answer pointed back to Clarke. At first, the attention came as a series of quiet inquiries. A colonel visited the hangar, watching Clarke from a distance as he worked, not speaking until Clarke finished adjusting a flathead screw on a flap hinge. "Are you Edward Clarke?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Clarke replied. The colonel studied him carefully. "You're the one doing these modifications." Clarke swallowed once. "Yes, sir." "You know that's against standard maintenance protocol." "Yes, sir." Another long moment passed. The colonel crouched next to the hinge assembly. He touched the stiffener lightly, feeling its shape, the contour Clarke had carefully formed to match airflow patterns. "Did you design this yourself?" "Yes, sir." The colonel examined the hinge more closely. "Why?" Clarke spoke quietly but without hesitation. The flaps were twisting under load. It changed landing behavior. The pilots adjusted instinctively, but the inconsistency caused structural stress. This stabilizes the airflow, makes the response predictable again. The colonel nodded slowly. "How many aircraft have you modified?" "More than 50 here," Clarke said. "And how many aircraft do you think are still landing safely because of it?" Clarke hesitated. "Hundreds, maybe more." "Try thousands, son." The colonel stood up and motioned for Clarke to follow him. They walked to the far side of the hangar where several officers waited with clipboards, charts, and data sheets. "Tell them what you told me," the colonel said. Clarke explained the idea again, its simplicity, its subtlety, its necessity. He didn't embellish anything. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the steady tone of someone who had thought through every detail dozens of times. When he finished, one officer looked at him with something like awe. "You're telling us that a strip of contoured reinforcement metal just saved 1,000 bombers?" Clarke shook his head. "No, sir, the pilots saved themselves. I just gave the flaps a chance to behave the way they were supposed to." The officer smiled. "Son, in war we call that saving 1,000 bombers." They ordered more modifications immediately. The news reached command headquarters. Technical reports flowed up the chain. Engineers across the Pacific began replicating Clarke's improvement. Bases wrote to each other asking for measurements and installation methods. Clarke found himself in constant demand from mechanics and officers alike. But with recognition came scrutiny. A group of inspectors flew in weeks later from a stateside engineering division. They wore crisp uniforms and carried rulebooks thick enough to stop a bullet. They weren't there to congratulate Clarke. They were there to determine if he had violated protocols so severely that he could face disciplinary action. They set up a temporary desk in the hangar and called Clarke over. "Explain the origin of this modification," one inspector said. Clarke did. "Who authorized it?" "No one," Clarke answered quietly. "Who approved it?" "No one." "Who documented it?" "I did, in my notes." The inspectors shook their heads. "You understand you performed an unauthorized alteration to a primary flight control system?" "Yes, sir." "You understand that could cost you your position?" "Yes, sir." "Why did you do it?" Clarke didn't pause, because the aircraft were failing. The head inspector leaned back, frowning. "And you believed you knew more than the design team who created the bomber?" Clarke shook his head. "No, sir, but I knew more about what was happening to them in combat." A silence filled the hangar. A thick, heavy silence. Finally, the colonel who had supported Clarke stepped forward, holding a stack of reports. He laid them on the inspector's desk. "These are the landing records from 6 bases," the colonel said. "Incidents dropped by more than 70% after this modification." He set another stack down. "These are pilot testimonies. Every one of them reports smoother flap behavior." Another stack. "And these," the colonel said, "are damage assessments from returning bombers. Notice the pattern. Less stress on the hinge assemblies, fewer hydraulic failures, fewer runway crashes." The inspectors flipped through the papers, their stern expressions softened by degrees. They couldn't argue with the data. They couldn't argue with the results. Clarke had broken rules, but he had also saved lives in numbers too large to ignore. The head inspector finally closed the folder and looked at Clarke. "You should have sought approval," he said. "Yes, sir." "You should have filed the proper forms." "Yes, sir." "You bypassed every regulation in the book." "Yes, sir." The inspector paused. "But you were right." Clarke blinked. "You were absolutely right." The head inspector gestured to the colonel. "We need this modification installed on every operational bomber, immediately." And just like that, the unofficial, unauthorized, borderline illegal idea became official. Orders went out. Factories adjusted production lines. Blueprints were updated. Operational manuals changed. Clarke didn't celebrate, he didn't even smile. He simply returned to the hangar, lifted another flap assembly and went back to work. The war didn't pause for innovation. Planes still needed fixing, crews still needed safe landings, and Clarke still felt responsible for every hinge he touched. The modification spread globally in less than 6 months. Bombers in Europe started using it. Crews in Italy began reporting smoother approaches. Airfields in England saw landing accidents plummet. Engineers in North Africa applied it to desert-worn aircraft with astonishing success. Everywhere the modification went, the pattern repeated. Landings became predictable. Accidents decreased. Survivability increased. Clarke heard rumors, quiet ones, that his idea had saved not just thousands but tens of thousands of aircrew by the war's end. He never asked for confirmation. He didn't need a number. He only needed to know that fewer families would receive telegrams because of a flaw nobody else noticed. But the war wasn't done with him. Not yet. One afternoon, months later, an aircraft limped into the field with one engine barely turning. Smoke trailed behind it. The landing gear hung unevenly. The wings carried so many holes they looked like they had been bitten by the sky itself. Clarke watched it approach. The flaps lowered. The aircraft stabilized. It touched down roughly but safely. The crew stepped out, shaken but alive. The pilot spotted Clarke near the hangar and walked over, dust and smoke still clinging to his flight suit. "You the engineer?" he asked. Clarke nodded. The pilot extended a hand. "Whatever you did to the flaps, it saved us. The plane was fighting itself the whole way home, but the landing god, I thought we were dead. Then the flaps behaved, like the aircraft remembered how to fly." Clarke didn't know what to say. He shook the pilot's hand quietly. The pilot held on for an extra second. "Thank you," he said. "You don't know how many boys you've saved." Clarke only replied, "I'm glad you made it back." That night, Clarke sat alone in the hangar long after the others had left. The tools lay scattered near his feet. The aircraft loomed above him like a massive steel guardian. The dim light cast long shadows across the concrete floor. He wasn't thinking about recognition. He wasn't thinking about regulations. He wasn't thinking about the war. He was thinking about the hinge assembly in front of him. About airflow. About strength. About stability. About how something so small could matter so much. He adjusted the wrench in his hand and kept working. Because the next bomber would need him. Months turned into seasons, and the war pressed onward with an urgency that left little room for reflection. Crews rotated in and out, aircraft arrived battered and left repaired, and the airfield changed faces faster than anyone could memorize names. But Clarke remained, quiet, steady, unmoving in his routine. Every sunrise found him under the wing of another bomber, running his fingers along metal that had just returned from hell. The new arrivals always told the same story, though they didn't know it. Each pilot talked about battles fought over the sea, flak tearing through the sky like jagged metal rain, fighters diving at them with a ferocity that made the cockpit feel too small, too fragile, too exposed. They spoke about engines failing, hydraulics bleeding out, fuel calculations done on shaking hands, and decisions made under pressure no human was meant to experience. But when they talked about landings, their voices changed. Not to fear, not to uncertainty, to gratitude. They mentioned how the aircraft softened on approach, how the controls felt stable even after hours of chaos. They talked about moments where the bomber should have crashed but didn't, how the flaps held steady, how the wings stayed level, how the machine behaved like it wanted to come home too. One day a young pilot, no older than 20, walked straight to Clarke after stepping off a B-24 peppered with holes and leaking oil across the runway. "You're the flap guy, right?" Clarke blinked. "I suppose." The pilot grinned tiredly. "Then you saved my life today, and probably everyone on my crew." Clarke nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. The pilot slapped his shoulder and walked away. Clarke watched him go with a quiet heaviness in his chest. He didn't feel pride, not exactly. What he felt was something deeper, something he couldn't name. The war had taken so much from so many. If a piece of metal he shaped by hand brought even one bomber home, the effort was worth it. But his work wasn't done, not even close. New problems emerged every month. Stress patterns changed as missions changed. Different theaters produced different conditions. Bombers that operated in humid Pacific air behaved differently than those flying through the thin, icy atmosphere over Europe. Clarke studied every detail, and slowly evolution crept into his design. He thickened the stiffener for aircraft operating in colder climates. He modified the contour angle for bombers flying through heavy turbulence. He adjusted bolt spacing to reduce vibration on long-haul missions. He tailored reinforcement curves based on the weight distribution of loaded aircraft. He didn't seek approval. Commanders simply told him, "Whatever you decide, make sure the crew can land." That was all the permission he needed. By late 1944, Clarke's once secret modification had become standard. New aircraft left factories with the reinforced flap design installed from the start. Engineering manuals included diagrams tracing directly back to Clarke's sketches. Young engineers were taught that certain stresses needed specific reinforcement contours, though most never knew who discovered it first. Clarke didn't mind. He never cared about credit. He cared about the hinge in front of him, the airflow it held back, the lives it supported. But one day, the war changed again. It began with a sound on the horizon, thunder, but not from the sky. A massive formation approached, dozens upon dozens of bombers returning from a mission deeper into enemy territory than any before. Their engines echoed across the coastline long before the aircraft came into view. Clarke stepped outside as the first silhouettes broke through the clouds. He counted 6, then 12, then 20, then more. One by one they lined up for approach, some with smoke trailing, some missing pieces of their wings, some wobbling from uneven control, but each aircraft seemed to regain composure as it lowered flaps. The descent stabilized, the touchdown smoothed, the rollouts remained controlled. Aircraft that had no business surviving the mission landed, as if the runways themselves reached up to catch them. Clarke watched every single one. A mechanic beside him whispered, "This is impossible." Clarke said nothing. He only listened to the engines slowly throttle down as more bombers came home. After nearly an hour, the final aircraft landed, a B-17 missing half its tail and flying only through sheer willpower and structural stubbornness. The pilots emerged half stumbling but alive. A crew chief helped one man down the ladder, and the airman pointed vaguely in Clarke's direction. "That guy, the one with the gloves, someone told me he's the reason these flaps don't kill us." He waved weakly. "Good work." Clarke lowered his head slightly. The moment felt unreal, not because of praise, he never sought it, but because he could see something in these crews he rarely saw. A hope. It was a quiet hope, a tired hope, but it was real. The next day, a general arrived unexpectedly. Officers followed him. They walked straight into the hangar and asked for Clarke by name. He emerged from beneath a wing, hands covered in grease, holding a wrench. "Edward Clarke?" the general asked. "Yes, sir," Clarke replied softly. The general studied him for a moment. "Son, do you know how many aircraft the Army Air Forces estimate your modification has kept from crashing?" "No, sir." "A conservative estimate, over 1,000, a more realistic one, several thousand." The general paused. "And how many men do you think were on those aircraft?" Clarke swallowed. "Tens of thousands, sir." The general nodded. "And most of them made it home alive." The hangar fell silent. Clarke didn't know what to say. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel deserving of the attention. He felt like an engineer who did what needed to be done, nothing more. The general continued, "The thing about war is that everyone looks to the sky for heroes. They expect the pilots, the aces, the men in cockpits, but heroes aren't only in the sky." He motioned to the flap assembly Clarke had been adjusting. "Sometimes they're right here under a wing with a wrench." Clarke felt the weight of those words settle onto him, heavier than any tool he had ever held. But the general didn't linger. He simply said, "Keep doing what you're doing," and walked away. Clarke returned to his work. He tightened a bolt, adjusted the alignment, checked the contour with careful, practiced movements. The praise didn't change anything. The responsibility stayed the same. If anything, it grew heavier. The next week a letter arrived, not from command, not from an officer, from a crewman he had never met. Inside was a short message. "Your flap idea saved us after our port engine died. The pilot said we should thank whoever kept the wings steady. So thank you. You saved 6 lives today." Clarke read it only once. Then he folded the paper and placed it inside his toolbox, beneath a layer of wrenches and pliers. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to. Knowing it existed was enough. The war continued and Clarke kept working. It didn't matter how many modifications he made or how many aircraft he reinforced. There was always another bomber, another crew, another hinge with another story hidden in its metal. But one quiet morning, long after the war had begun turning in the Allies' favor, a pilot approached him cautiously. He held a flight helmet in one hand and stared at Clarke with an expression somewhere between admiration and exhaustion. "You don't know me," the pilot said, "but I've flown 12 missions. We limped home from half of them, engines failing, wings shot up, flaps sticking. One time we had so much damage we thought we'd fall out of the sky. But every time, every single time, the aircraft responded when we lowered flaps. Every time." Clarke looked up but said nothing. "That's because of you," the pilot continued. "Most of us will never get to repay the debt we owe you, but I want you to know your name gets passed around up there. Quietly, respectfully, we say the wings hold because Clarke said they would." A long silence hung between them. Clarke finally said, "Thank you." The pilot nodded and walked away. Clarke watched him go, then returned to his workbench. By the end of the war, Clarke's reinforcement concept had been installed on nearly every operational bomber in the theater. Engineers back in the States incorporated it into new production models. Aerodynamicists studied it, reworked it, and published papers on airflow stabilization that would influence civilian aircraft design for decades. But Clarke didn't follow any of that. When the war ended, he packed his tools into a small wooden crate, carefully placed his worn notebook on top, and walked away from the hangar for the last time. He didn't stay for awards. He didn't stay for ceremonies. He didn't even wait for formal recognition. He went home. He returned to a quiet life. A small town. A small workshop. A small problems. But occasionally, only occasionally, he would see a bomber in a museum or in an air show, resting under bright lights, polished and preserved. And if he looked closely, if he leaned in just enough, he could see the contour of the flap assembly, the subtle reinforcement, the idea he had shaped with his own hands. He would smile softly, run a finger along the metal edge and whisper to himself, "They came home." He never needed more than that. Because Clarke knew something the rest of the world often forgot. Sometimes the greatest heroes never touched a cockpit, never fired a weapon, never flew a mission. Sometimes all it takes to save 1,000 bombers is a quiet engineer who sees a problem no one else sees and has the courage to fix it when no one else will. And because of him, they did come home.